I really want to.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Good.
took me a while to get into it. I'm like,
Never one of those conference calls charge less than
I guess you could live in Queens.
great.
Yeah.
Begin tomorrow. It's nice.
It depends. I usually both of us. I didn't realize you looked at the girl. Jordan?
No, the BBC one.
Which is English, written by Europeans, technical papers.
I've read some of that.
Sounds good. I couldn't do so right this morning.
There's a train that goes like straight into Manhattan.
I'm not sure who officially is the OASIS member, if it's us or Cornell. Let me find out. So we usually find out. I mean, it's not going to go by 1 minute's computer at this moment, even though you did.
Yes.
Yeah, because it
Oh, yeah.
it's not positive.
I replied.
Literally,
I wouldn't
right into the
There's Marco for the record. We've tried this for years.
Or vice versa, if you get two left.
Yeah, I've taken a bunch of them, like walks.
We're gonna run. Hi, how you doing? I'm doing great.
I assume they're giving That could be interesting.
Can we have the presentation?
Hey, we're supposed to start at 1?
Yes.
Great, I have a microphone that works. The power will go to my head. Welcome, everybody. This is a session on what's going on with the OASIS LegalCiteM Technical Committee. My name is Joergensen. I am a co-chair of that committee. I was wondering what to do with this session. I was just asked to update everybody on what's going on. And my inclination is that there's people of all different levels of technical knowledge and involvement, which is actually really good under the circumstances, and I'll talk about why in a few minutes. So what I thought I'd do is just give a fairly quick general discussion about what OASIS is, what the technical committee is doing and what it is and who's in it and why they're in it and what we're trying to get done. And I'm going to try and do that fast so that we can have lots of time for question and discussion, because I think that will actually be more useful than me rattling on about why we're doing something when I can just say it quickly and then talk about it in a discussion. I will tell you right up front that when I was putting together some slides, felt I had to have slides, there was a certain person who made a dare to me, and you can guess what the dare was. So lots of people here who have absolutely no good reason to know what OASIS is. It has been around for ever since pretty much XML has been around. It was formed, was it the 80s or early 90s? As an XML standards organization at a time when people were starting to talk about DTDs and the idea was that especially for business and industry, certain open standards for XML would be wonderful for allowing communications between businesses, communications between all kinds of organizations. And in fact, that's what OASIS does. Most of its work is with all sorts of different industries where they have, a business markup language and other technical markup languages for all different sorts of communication needs. And so industry standards for actual use, where people in industry are actually programming around these things. In the late 90s, there was actually an organization called LegalXML, which didn't last. It had its problems, I'll say that. It became a part of OASIS. I mean, I was involved with it at least a little bit early on. And it became part of OASIS. It struggled along. It has actually done a pretty good job with a court filing standard, which is all they really got done. Now there are a couple of LegalXML offshoots that are actually doing some work right now, one of which is LegalCiteM. The other one is, what is its actual name, Tom?
It's LegalDocML.
Yeah, LegalDocML, which is creating, I have it written down. Yeah, LegalDocML, which is actually standardizing a system called Acoma Ntoso, which was developed by Italians under grant from the UN to, actually the goal, right, is a parliament in a box?
Yeah.
For emerging democracies. So a large markup system for legal materials, mostly, they would be mad at me if I say this, but I'll say it anyway, mostly oriented around legislation and preparing legislation, but expandable to include all law. So, and my co-chair is actually somebody who is very involved in LegalDocML, has been involved in Acoma Ntoso for years and years, Fabio Vitali from the University of Bologna. And he is also an ITIG, right?
No.
No?
No, those two guys, those two organizations fight a lot. Actually.
Surprise. So, what's the threat here? What's the problem to be solved? One of the things that's really missing, and in fact, one of the things I should talk about right now is what we're not doing. What we're not doing, and the thing that I'm very interested in anyway, but what we're not doing, is advocating for universal citations as a print standard or a standard for writing legal materials. What LegalCiteM is trying to do will necessarily accommodate such things, and it would work really, really well, and it's a great thing. But what we're trying to do is something a little different. What we're talking about is a machine-readable standard for legal material, such that material that's being published on the internet, be it from a for-profit company, a nonprofit, or an educational institution, will have a common standard to mark up citations within their documents so that they can all be interpreted and read by the same set of rules, and so therefore people can write resolvers and interpreters in order to be able to connect together things in a much more uniform and universal manner. Imagine that, legal documents on the internet, and anytime there's a citation to a case, a piece of legislation, anything like that, there will be a link there that can be resolved to a copy of that document somewhere else. We're not writing resolvers. That's going to be for individuals to do. I might write one. Might get somebody else to write one. Businesses will write them. I mean, we have representatives from Lexis. We have representatives from other legal publishers. Hopefully we'll get somebody from West sitting in too, but not quite yet. And that's the goal, to make resolvers possible. So before everybody, half the people here walk out, it is a highly abstract thing we're talking about, but an incredibly useful one, and one that actually needs the efforts of quite a lot of people from a lot of directions. What we're doing right now is we've been broken up into subcommittees. A subcommittee for court documents, a subcommittee for legislation, a subcommittee for secondary sources, a subcommittee for executive branch and regulatory material, and actually I think that's it. And then a technical subcommittee, which is working on the kinds of strings we'll be putting together. I mean, this is, get a little bit technical here. You've got basically a URL, which is an address which is usually somewhat temporary in nature, which gives you a link to a document on the internet. There are also URIs, Uniform Resource Identifiers, and Uniform Resource Names. There's currently a small debate whether we're going to do URIs or URNs. Never mind about that right now. What we're doing is making a string that will describe a document that will be readable by humans but interpretable by machines, so that we can have a resolver, have a machine link things together. That's what the technical subcommittee is doing. What the other committees are doing, the substantive committees right now, and a big bulk of their work is going to be done when this is finished, is to create use cases, to be able to define the scope and the elements of what's being worked with. So that, for example, when you're talking about the courts subcommittee, there are all kinds of court decisions out there. Slip opinions, published in Reporter court decisions, decisions that may be on the internet that may have a universal citation attached to them. And they come out in different forms. And no matter how they're published, they are identified in certain ways, by the Blue Book or something beyond the Blue Book. And of course, we're not just talking about American materials as well. We're talking about the world here. There's people from all over the world participating in this. And so the use cases will include Japanese tribunals, Chinese tribunals, Australian, Indian, Cambodia, all of Europe as well. So what the use cases, the committee doing use cases for court materials is really doing is identifying the identifiers for court cases, seeing if they fall into categories and can be regularized. What are the necessary elements to identify all of these documents? Not a small job, but a significant job, and quite frankly, it's a doable job. The other committees are doing the very same thing right now for secondary source materials, for executive branch regulatory materials, legislation. So, once those are all done, then the committees are all going to come together. We're going to harmonize the approach, which will take a while, so that all of these things can be put together, and then we'll have a draft standard to publish. A lot of work, but kind of doable. That's why, and it's messy, so there's a cat with stuff. As I was saying before, what the end result is going to be a format for a string and a syntax for making identifier strings together. So there's a cat with a string. So for some examples, this is a standard that's already a little bit out there that actually, quite frankly, may become something we're going to adopt, and it's probably going to be something fairly close to it. This is a standard called URN Lex, so Universal Uniform Resource Names for Law. This was written in Italy by just Enrico Francesconi?
No, it was a small team from Italy.
Okay. Yeah, and
Enrico and two others.
they came up with a fairly comprehensive string set for putting things together. Now, this may not be the way it is because there are other standards out there, and quite frankly, people using the other standards are also on the technical committee of LegalCiteM. There are advantages and disadvantages to each of these, and it's being worked out right now. But this is an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about as a result. So let's start with the middle one, which would be the most recognizable, a U.S. Supreme Court decision. If you look at the string, it starts to make a whole lot of sense. URN Lex. So it is a URN. It is a Lex URN. So this is the kind of, a machine can read this and say, okay, this is what I'm dealing with. A URN Lex URN string. From the United States, a federal one from the Supreme Court, descending order of identification, starting with general and becoming more specific as needed. And then a date string, and then what do we have available for this particular decision? We have a Blue Book style citation, and that's the end of the string. Once you get here, quite frankly, there's options, and things will have to be dealt with and regularized. But as you can see, there's a very strict order to how this comes together. That's the kind of thing we're looking to do, and that's the kind of result we're going to come up with. Similarly, something from completely across an ocean here, a decision of the Belgian Council of State. URN Lex, Belgium, Council of State, the date, and then the number of the decision. The same kind of thing from a very different place. On top of European Union directive. Very different kind of thing again. This is not a court decision, but you get a very similar kind of string. You get a location, and then what kind of document it is, a date, and then the identifier that comes along with it. Again, this is not necessarily what we're going to end up with. We're going to end up with something almost certainly very much like it. But quite frankly, the bulk of the work that needs to be done is not figuring out where to put these things within the string, but what the strings need to consist of. That's not really technical computer-oriented work. That's librarian work. So just talking about, again, who's doing this kind of thing. There are several librarians involved in this effort from the United States and elsewhere. There are representatives from the European Union, the British National Archives, University of Bologna, that's where my co-chair comes from, and even some people from the University of Nagoya in Japan. This is an international effort, and it's going to be an international standard to apply to everything. The deliverables, I've really talked about this already. We're going to make use case documents that are going to actually have a lot of value even outside of any standard we come out with. We're going to define the elements of legal citations, generally speaking, in a way that other people will be able to use them. We're going to come out with the technical methodological documents, and we will come out with the schema. So the string standard for putting it all together at the end. So what do we need at this point? Kitty is telling you, we need you. We need a lot of expertise from all over the place. people who are familiar with URN and URI standards, people familiar with RDF and XML standards. So to work on the technical committee to add their expertise for that. What we really, really need, though, are content experts, particularly librarians, quite frankly. We need people who understand the use and nature of citations, who can understand how they break down, what creates a unique identifier for a legal document or object, once we start getting into, properly abstract spheres of what a document really consists of on the internet, etc. What describes it sufficiently? And so, we all know that the basic Blue Book citation to a reporter does not give a unique identifier. What else do we need? What's necessary? A slip opinion has a completely different set of identifiers that still need to be in one way or another reconciled with things like print citations. And that with uniform citations as well. A lot of interesting work to do that a lot of people have expertise that will be very valuable to contribute. So that's what we're doing. That's why it's important. And that's what everybody can do with it if they're interested. Or if you just want to follow along and see how we're doing with it as the time goes by. It's going to be a fairly long-term project, a couple of years, I imagine, before everything gets done. I thought a year to begin with, but that's crazy, because there's actually a lot of work to be done, figuring out citations. So that's my short presentation. I can leave the cat up if you want. So let's talk about this.
I have a naive question, deliberately naive question. What are the consumption scenarios for these strings, right? So if I'm holding one of these magically designed strings, where can I hand it in to get something, and who's going to come along and snatch it out of my hand in order to get something?
They can be used in all sorts of contexts. The biggest context in which they can be used is with people who are actually doing legal publishing in any kind of context, right? And it's going to be in the form of writing resolvers. I'm a legal publisher, I adopt this standard, and I embed these kinds of strings to identify as the background link data inside of all the documents I have. So all the citations will be a hot link that you can just look at and it'll look normal, but if you point your mouse pointer at it, you'll see the URN string. And that's going to be something that'll be passed off to a computer program. And nonprofits, for-profits will be writing what we would call resolver programs. And a resolver program, well, think of an average court decision and think of how they're distributed as things are developing here on the internet. We've got Lexis, Bloomberg, Westlaw, Fastcase, Justia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also have the courts themselves. We also have the LIIs. We also have other nonprofits who are publishing legal material. We can all use the same standard and refer to each other's decisions that way. I can make links to my own stuff using this schema, because everything, the string will break down to identify what's being referred to in a way where I can say, okay, this is what I'm dealing with. I have a copy for it over there. And the program is what's going to actually do the decision. Looking at it, I have a copy over there. What if I don't have a copy of everything, but I'm working with Tom, and Tom has a whole bunch of other stuff, and we all use the same standard? The citation string in the background will identify the material. I can say either I have it, or Tom has it, or Justia has it, and we can make appropriate links to go where everything can be. A general distribution of the law where everybody's material can talk to each other in a way that people can use independently of each other, but still end up with a cooperative system. You can see how this would be attractive to a large company too, like Lexis. They'll be able to link to other stuff as well as to within their own stuff. We could link to Lexis's stuff.
Or just to go another step in a slightly different direction, some of you are probably old enough to remember the days in which offices in corporations had large beeping boxes that sat on the wall, whose job it was to determine the least expensive toll call service to use when anyone inside the company was making a long distance call. You can imagine writing a resolver that's weighted in terms of cost factors for a particular organization so that you hit this thing with the identifier for, Miranda v. Arizona or whatever, and it automatically selects the least cost service.
I mean, in a way, I do this right now, and in a very scaled back kind of way with material that I have, and I know you do it as well, Tom. When I bring in New Jersey court cases into our court's database, all of the citations that we can find in them are made into hot links, and that hot link is actually made to a standard URL, which talks to a CGI script, which is a resolver, and it takes the volume, reporter, and page number, and what the program does. So you click on the link, the program gets activated, and that program gets the volume, reporter, and page number. It calls a database, and that database has a listing of the citation of every court case we have in our collection. So the first thing it does is say, do we have it? And if we have it, it just gives you our copy, and then it's done. If it doesn't come up in our database, there's a couple of algorithms to see whether there's a free copy out there, and it tries to get you a free copy from a couple of sources like the LII, and if it doesn't have a free source, we try and connect. It used to work at least, but things have been changing with Lexis and Westlaw so much, it's hard to keep up. But we had a string where it would say, okay, here's the string to get it from Lexis, here's the string to get it from Westlaw. Just like Tom was saying, a descending order. We try and give you ours first. If we don't have it, we try and give you a free source. If we don't know a free source, then we say at least offer you the links to a pay service. And that's the thing you can do so much better and so much more universally with a general standard. And again, to make a truly general standard, we need to we need people who really understand citations and enjoy working with them. Imagine that.
And you're talking about citation at the document level, right?
Yes.
At the document level.
So no pin sites, no paragraph numbers.
So, yeah, you're not going.
You know, why not, actually?
Can I lobby you?
For pin sites or for no pin sites?
For not getting involved in, with all respect to those present, what AALL did when they did their citation standard some years ago, which is assigning semantics to paragraphs. Designating a paragraph as being anything other than two chunks of text separated by a couple of hard returns turns paragraph numbering in the back file into a fifth generation AI project that it does not need to be. Right? If you think about this idea of, well, courts will individually decide what a paragraph is, so as to exclude, say, hanging quotes or whatever. The poor guy who has to sit there and write the program that's going to assign paragraph numbers to 10 gajillion cases in the back file has a nasty problem, particularly if the rules vary from court to court.
There's two things going on there.
Okay.
And the first thing is the easy out, which I would like to take at this time.
Okay.
Which is that, granted your problem, which I'll object to in a second, But granted the difficulties that you've put out there, that's not the problem to be solved by LegalCiteM and the standard. We're making a standard whereby you can make those references. Whether those references are reasonable to make or not is a separate question. And quite frankly, page pin sites that we still have to accommodate because a lot of citations out there that should be coded up are in the form of Blue Book reporter references. Those pin sites should be accommodated as well. And if we can do that, why not? As long as they're clearly recognizable by a machine as a pin site. And so why not just have paragraphs as one of the options? So we can just do it, so let's do it. Getting beyond what LegalCiteM is doing, absolutely yes. But that's something that also actually deserves a lot more discussion. Because there are ways around that involve cooperation and standards. I still think that there are reasonable algorithms out there and ways in which we can have a general paragraphing standard, even if the courts will never do it. To the extent that a court does it, well then you're done. They can have a semantic paragraph, or they can have a completely arbitrary paragraphing system that's all screwy. It doesn't matter as long as those paragraph numbers are there, which identify sections of a document which is useful for a pinpoint site. I mean, a page is just as arbitrary.
You're right, and I think the place that we need to be careful, though, is here. I'm not concerned with the level of screwiness necessarily, although, there are aesthetics involved, and I have some. What I am concerned about is that whatever sort of screwiness is put forward is screwiness that can be implemented in an identical way by disparate organizations looking at the same corpus. So if I've got two publishers out there who are going to retro-convert all of the New York opinions from the 19th century, I want two publishers to be able to have a fighting chance of doing that in an identical way.
Right.
So make it predictive, where it's like, if I'm looking at this, I know what the next thing is going to be based on.
That's the real question. That is exactly the real question. And that's doable.
There will be a lot of pressure in ways both obvious and subtle to make that kind of reproducibility impossible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to say it's possible, which I insist it is, doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, that was my idea behind universalcitation.org, which is, again, getting way beyond the OASIS project. But what seems to me the most reasonable approach to this is to have a first-past-the-post system for the assignment of sequence numbers to create a universal citation to start with, and also to assign paragraph numbers. And not to get into the business of actually republishing, because that's what all the publishers who would contribute to Universal Cite do. But I think an algorithm can be put forward so that a document gets submitted, the paragraph numbers get assigned, and then available to the rest of the world is an algorithm that would allow you to, in no matter what format you have, put those same paragraph numbers in the same places. So that universalcitation.org is not a competing publisher, but allows everybody to assign the same numbers. If you strip it all down to pure text, and then run the algorithm to assign the paragraphs, and then make that available to everybody, everybody can strip down to plain text and run the same algorithm, in theory. Something like that, maybe.
Sure, I mean, NLP researchers do very similar stuff when they're trying to compare corpora. It's doable.
Yeah.
Not quite clear if it's desirable, but it's doable.
Yeah. Well, lawyers need to do pinpoint sites. Otherwise, you know, a 50-page opinion, it becomes unmanageable. So it's a good thing to do. It's going to be necessary in one way or other because people are going to do it somehow. So there you go. We just have to avoid the temptation to have a standard that includes like bytes into or word counts. Because I don't think that will actually make it into any kind of universal citation standard. It's not what people think about. So that's another thing that's going on with legal citations. You're all overwhelmed. So think of questions. Sarah has one.
I was going to just ask you to expand on the scope of standardization for different kinds of references, because one of the problems that application developers encounter frequently is that they have enough in front of them in terms of the text to construct reliably a reference that can be subsequently disambiguated, but not enough to construct the formal identifier for a document. And so one of the things that happens is that there are different flavors of references, and I know that Fabio Vitale, when he's presenting this, has been showing a number of examples of those things, and so I think maybe it would be helpful for the other people in the room to get more information about that problem and that process.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's not a whole lot you can do about that. It's just the nature of citations that they're not always sufficiently clear that you can completely disambiguate. The context of the document as a whole, though, needs to be taken into account. And at that point, if you need a human to do the interpretation, well, that's what you need.
But how far do you and Fabio envision getting into the standard for constructing references that are incomplete, if at all?
So wait a minute, what you're imagining, I'm trying to understand the question. What you're imagining is a situation in which an application developer does the equivalent of finding one page torn out of the Federal Reporter laying on the ground, and you can see that it's page 395, but not a what?
No, let's just say
No, I think
extracting citations from a back file where
okay.
you don't have the date of the case, the full date of the case as
Yeah.
in 2010-0309,
Okay.
but you have, or 1963-0318, but you have 372 US 335, right?
Exactly.
Got it.
We're not sure yet. That's a discussion. Well, you know,
It's a straightforward answer, John.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an important question. It's one that probably needs to be accommodated as is. My own inclination is to do the best you can with what you've got when you're actually in production. So this eventual standard would be fully fleshed out and expect everything, but what are you going to do if you don't have full information? Well, I mean, in this case, you can get this document without having a date. In other circumstances, if this were in fact something different, like a slip opinion with a docket number, well, then that would be a lot more ambiguous. But would this together, but without the date, given a docket number, get you close? And that's something that we need to actually discuss and talk about and come to a conclusion on. That's something that's got to be still talked about. And it's an important issue.
So in that scenario, is the general bias you think right now toward accessibility or full description in that limited context? In the sense that do you want to put just enough to get it, or are we going to? Because some of this is additional information.
For the purposes of this kind of project, the purpose is identification. And to the extent that the description, to the extent that you have to have more description to disambiguate in different circumstances because you have variability in the practical material you have to deal with. Am I getting too abstract
No,
here?
I know.
Yeah, then you have to go beyond and you get closer to what looks like description.
Yeah.
But the goal is identification and naming.
See, what I would want in that scenario, I think, and I'm putting myself now in the head of an application developer, is actually something out of the resolver. What I would want the resolver to do is respond to me in the way that an HTTP server does by saying, in effect, I can't figure out what the hell you want. I can figure out what the hell you want, but I know more about it than you told me, and here's what.
Yeah.
Or here you go, pal, right? I mean, I want those three levels of response.
So fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, in fact, part of the thing that's so interesting about it, at least I find interesting about it, because, you know, I'm who I am, and that's what it is. But you can add your own adjectives, right? You've got things that are going to be necessarily ambiguous that you have to deal with, the advent of ambiguity. You've also got the different kinds of citations that need to be harmonized in some way so you can have a single way of describing things that will handle all these different ways of citing to things. You've also got, in a completely different category of interesting question, a lot of information that's actually not explicit but implicit in citations that you can derive, but it's not actually explicitly there. You know, think of your average Blue Book print citation. You know, MD, what does that mean? Well, we know it means the Supreme Court of Maryland. It doesn't say that. Right? But that is an interesting situation. And that's not just limited to America, of course, right? ER, what's that?
It's a general problem in identifier design. I mean, how much semantics do you want to put in there and risk having them relied on by someone who would rather parse the string and deal with the identifier or simply misinterpret what it represents? I mean, is that MD Maryland or is it a doctor?
Right. You know, but in the form of something like a URN Lex string.
Sure.
Clearly not the doctor. It's clearly a U.S. state Maryland decision. But when you're talking about writing an algorithm that can actually take that citation and make it into something like a URN Lex string, you have to just know and write into your system that ND is going to resolve instead of federal Maryland. And the fact that MD with no other letters after it will mean Supreme Court.
And I assume the dates.
And that's interesting.
And the way the dates function as well.
Yeah.
Because looking at the second example, that would not be a European court decision date order.
Yeah.
Because you can't have an 18th month. Because they do day first.
No, well that's
Well, that's standard. That's
Yeah.
a standard ISO.
March 18th, 1963.
Yeah, so
Which we'll probably standard on because that's
That's
The
an ISO
ISO
standard.
version. Not-
Yeah,
if you
that's
put
an
the
ISO
year
standard.
first, then that's the ISO.
It's year, month, day.
ISO 8601.
Okay. Good to know.
I don't know, I deal with my SQL tables too much, so I'm actually starting to think that way. It's
Coming in
making
from
problems for me at times.
Library.
It's the only date format that makes sense.
Yeah, descending
Because it's
order.
sortable.
Exactly. You think logic was.
I'm also thinking about library users who don't always think about it.
Right,
That's
but
why you write the program.
that's fine because this is not something that the user is actually going to see, right? They're going to see 372 US 335.
Of course.
And if they paid attention when they were pointing their mouse at it on the bottom, they might see this string. And it doesn't, if it doesn't make any sense to them, that's
I was just
fine.
thinking about, there's some people that like to predict URLs.
Uh-huh.
Like they're gonna, so they can just type it straight in to get there, and that's the kind of thing I was thinking of, like people who,
And this also isn't the.
Well, this is going to be absolutely predictable, right?
yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
You gotta understand the ISO standard, but there you go.
So I have a question. What about for items that are maybe older or things, like I'm thinking of your scanning project where you have older books that get scanned in, and if maybe two people or two different libraries scan the same things, or maybe even parts of things, maybe this person only had chapter 1 of this book instead of chapter 3 of that book, or whatever the legal equivalent would be. Is there any way in there to say specifically, like, we've got half the court decision, or we have it, but if you have a better one, go look at the better one? You know what I'm saying?
To a certain extent, the last bit of your question is a question of a resolver, and not necessarily the string, the citation string.
Can
That's
the screen
something,
record quality?
it is not anticipated at this time that we would recover that, but that's an interesting question. And something I'm gonna bring up on a phone call that's going to make a whole bunch of things blow up.
I'm glad you answered.
I was gonna say, I can just imagine the stream of quasi-English that will read that, but.
To a certain extent, that kind of thing that the earlier part of your question is actually would be covered by something like a pinpoint site. So if I've got chapter 1 and part of the string for a congressional document identifier would be URN Lex US Federal Congressional Document Hearing. I'm making this up as I go along, but you can kind of see what I'm doing here. And then the designation of the document, however that goes, S.RPT 107-36 for a Senate report. And then room for a pinpoint site, and we could accommodate something like part 1. Okay, you could do that, and if that's all you got, then that's your string for that. That's not quite what you were talking about, but that's something that's a possibility out there. The other part that's kind of, I don't think you directly asked, but is implied by what you're talking about, is again another question for resolvers, is if I've got a copy and you've got a copy and this other person's got a copy, which one are you actually going to bring up? That's the choice of the person writing the resolver program, right? I'm going to want to resolve to mine. A Justia.com who may for some reason wants to rely on the University of Kansas, who's got a bunch of stuff, can use the URN string to just bring up University of Kansas's copy. Why not? Save everybody a little bit of storage space. Spread out the rest.
Well, it provides failover.
Yeah, and by failover, you can write into your resolver a timeout. If Kansas isn't giving you within 3 seconds, get it from Rutgers. Again, why not? That would make a pretty good system. So, I'm also a big believer in duplication. Everybody should have a copy of everything because that's how information survives. Not by everybody going to GPO and relying on GPO's effective one copy. Everybody seems to have access because everybody can get to GPO on the internet, but that brings us to one point of failure, which is the recipe for long-term disaster. And it's going to happen someday. But that's, again, another set of hobby horses that I'll ride at some time.
Or hobby cats.
So, you know what? Thank you all for coming. I will hang around for other questions. If there are other questions from the group right now, that'll be fine. But we can end early if we want, right?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, very impressive.
8601.
Your team's losing, Lucy.
Yeah, and that call, don't.
Just no, it's a good response. You wait, you
See the tweet?
It's like say what?
We know.
By the way, while you were talking, I took the opportunity to look up the OASIS website.
Where it's at. Which door? The left side. Is it the hills? You're supposed to be over there? I don't know. Well, it will move. Like 6 plus 8. And it'll be down. So we have it exactly. Yeah, so come on, Costa.
You want all the big names to go down, like the Brazil, Spain.
I know what England do.
And you still have the right smile.
I would just like I think Germany are actually.
Next up.
Oh, awesome.
Next up.
She is now the person.
Oh, yeah, that's cool.
She is the oncologist. We have a tiara and everything. It's here.
Yeah, actually.
How you get some registering? I had a three yesterday, but I'm go see Steve. Oh, yeah. I know, we were just checking. I didn't take it.
You know, we actually.
Kimberly just gave me one.
I'm running downstairs.
Where are you going? I was going to.
I've seen other.
See Elmer.
There's like a you are?
And yet you're teaching class.
Yes, well, I'm gonna hang around. My wife is
Oh, okay.
the librarian, so she can go and do stuff. I'm just checking out.
But you've been to some events.
Well, I got a floor pass to go with pizza sitters.
Oh, that's nice.
And
No, nobody wanted to. Well, I told you.
it's like my alumni association
It
has
happened, it's
something.
over.
Wow. I work on camera.
Thanks.
I would never complain on that.
And let's talk.
Across the street. Which one do you go to next?
I'm not sure, I think I'm gonna go to this one.
They want to meet at Legal Seafood somewhere near
I'm gonna
MIT.
go to this one. You guys?
I'm gonna multiple choice.
So you can probably make arrangements to meet them all in the lobby. That's where they're all staying anyway.
Yeah.
That's real.
No, they're not. But, and since it's near MIT.
Yeah.
We can probably meet, I'll meet them with the commander, we can pick you up, and
No,
can Okay.
teach you a minute.
something like
My professor told me his counselor last week.
that. Nobody.
Okay, give it a.
You want me to go for it?
Or we're leaving from
I
here.
mean, I don't know what, I wonder how it would be
Here
better.
or here.
The one that, that's the one I heard it happened to.
Where did they go?
Because
just
did
say
you see
the-
Brian lately? I saw him this morning. I don't get service inside the building.
From New England?
Yeah.
He was in our class this morning.
This morning's the first time I've seen him
Okay.
this whole week.
And then,
If you see him, tell him I'm looking for him. My phone does not, oh, maybe I'll send him an email, that's what it is.
So good.